Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of FIREside Chat. I'm Zach Greenberg, your host, a legal fellow here at FIRE, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleagues, Ripp from the Campus Outreach Department, Gordon Danning, our History Research Fellow, and Mary Zoeller from our Policy Reform Department. Today, we're going to discuss two of some issues that we see at FIRE on a daily basis: hate speech and academic freedom. Amazingly, these issues converge at one university, Stanford, where within the span of a week, a student newspaper called on a professor to resign based on his alleged ties to the Antifa movement, and a student had his flyers torn down by campus resident assistants because they were allegedly hate speech. So turning to the professor first, Gordon, this professor was allegedly tied to the Antifa movement. The student newspaper said that, look, we shouldn't have professors like this teaching students here. What is the role of academic freedom in this scenario? How is he protected by this?
Well, this is a good example. I think, my understanding is that he doesn't really claim to be part of Antifa, but of a different movement. But even if he were, even if he were advocating violence as a way of making social change, I mean, that's what people research. Should violence work? Does nonviolence work better? And it seems to me it's perfectly legitimate for a professor to say, no, I think if you want social change, you have to engage in violence. That's my understanding of history.
I understand that. That's a good point. I think a lot of people are very confused about what academic freedom means. How does it protect professors? Can you just go into exactly what academic freedom means in this case?
In this case, it means that academics have a right to say what they want, research what they want, come to the conclusions that they want, and the government, or in this case, Stanford University, can't tell them what they can and cannot advocate or say.
Excellent.
Oh, thank you.
Mary, you also work with academic freedom a lot here at FIRE through your work with the Chicago Statement, getting universities to adopt this statement. And you sent a couple letters to Stanford regarding their academic freedom policies. Would you care to talk about those letters?
Yeah, we have. So we sent a mass mailing to all universities in California, basically talking to them about their recent legislation last summer, which suggested that public and private universities in California should adopt a Chicago statement-like free speech statement on protecting both academic freedom and then students' rights to free speech as well. And we, of course, sent one of those letters to Stanford. And they did put out a nice statement in November regarding academic freedom and free speech rights of their students, but they have not yet adopted the Chicago statements. So we'd still, of course, urge them to do so just to protect the rights of their students and faculty.
And did Stanford ever get back to you with those letters?
We have not heard back from Stanford, but we're still hopeful that they might adopt.
So Stanford, if you're watching, we appreciate if you would stop ghosting us. A simple text message saying, hey, got your letter, love you. Respectfully, Stanford, we would deeply appreciate it.
We would.
We would, exactly.
I think the Stanford case was really interesting because, the college Republicans were calling for the professor to resign, so there's certainly a liberal impulse there. They weren't calling for him to be fired, and then this led to kind of this back and forth, this dueling editorials, and I actually really like to see that. So once again, I thought there was a liberal impulse, but at the same time, he was engaged in some pretty controversial activities. He was courting controversy. He was putting himself out there. He should have expected some kind of a response.
Yeah, and he's not the only professor that had these very controversial expression association. For example, we have former Drexel professor George Cicarelli-Omar, who tweeted out Christmas Eve in 2016, all they want for Christmas is white genocide. We have another professor who tweeted out, what did he say? During the Navy Yard shooting, he said that the blood is on your hands in the NRA. Next time, let it be your sons and daughters. Shame on you. May God damn you. As you can see, these professors tweeted out some pretty controversial statements. And Gordon, if you were the head of the university and you were hearing these calls from students, from legislatures, from other professors that we need to fire these professors, they have no right to be in this college campus, how would you respond to these people?
Well, the Supreme Court has very clearly said that these sorts of statements are protected speech. For you or me or anyone on the street. So why would you suggest that a professor would have less free speech than anybody else? Clearly, if I can say it, if someone else can say it, then a professor can say it. Even if it's, so obviously some of these tweets are done emotionally or not exactly great, brilliant, rhetoric, but still, they have a right to say it, and so the university should stand up for people's rights.
Yeah, and some would say that the First Amendment protects people who have these controversial and somewhat offensive statements the most. That's deserving of the most protection on college campuses. It's not the people that say the pretty banal run-of-the-road things. It's these professors, exactly.
Right, and as you noted, Gordon, there are Supreme Court protections for academic freedom, but additionally, some would argue that universities and colleges who have statements on academic freedom might have a contractual obligation to uphold those statements. So often, the AUP put out an academic freedom statement in 1940, I believe, and many colleges and universities have adopted that statement, which is a broad-based statement talking about academic freedom and how professors, all types of professors, adjuncts, tenured professors, have these rights to academic freedom. So there is an argument that they have a contractual obligation to uphold those rights.
Oh, definitely. And I know a lot of these campuses, they have in their policies to protect academic freedom, for example, but they don't really explain what that is. One commentator stated that academic freedom is this very amorphous concept. It's this idea that there's no adequate analysis of what academic freedom protects, and lacking definition or guiding principle, the doctrine floats in the law, picking up decisions as a whole does barnacles. So here we're trying to just scrape the whole barnacles, really figure out what academic freedom means. I think you talked earlier about how it has the right to say extramural statements that may not be in the classroom, but still related to their subject matter. But where do we draw the line here? When does that actually become unprotected speech?
I want to push back on what you just said. Why does it have to be necessarily related to their subject matter? I'm a history research fellow, and I'm looking at, the political science around violence and things like that. And there are people who bring in perspectives from other fields that can be very valuable. So I would say that, I don't know that academic freedom necessarily. This one person at Stanford is a literature professor. But again, sometimes literature has insights into, sociology or economics or what have you. So I don't think we can limit it to the person's field.
Right, all sorts of fields. Interesting. So sticking with Stanford, we have another incident within a week of this one where a student had his flyers torn down by campus RAs. And this is an interesting case because the flyers so in his words, he woke up one day and he found flyers saying, if you see immigration agents around campus, please call this hotline, report them. It's a very common flyer from many campuses that consider themselves to be sanctuary campuses or cities that are very pro-immigrant. They're trying to protect their immigrant communities. And in response to this, he put up a flyer saying, if you see law enforcement officials doing their job, please report these people and protect the criminals of our community. And the RA said, look, these flyers are hate speech. We don't want them to be on our campus. And Luke, I know you deal a lot with students, and especially students that call for hate speech bans. What would you say to these students?
Yeah, we deal with students on both sides of these issues. We deal with students who are calling for hate speech bans and really are asking me, how do I confront hate speech on campus? And then students like this student at Stanford who was censored and put through this kind of bureaucratic process because he put up some satirical flyers. I think in the case of the student at Stanford, he really performed very, very well. He did his research. He knew the school's policies. He knew his rights. He even knew about California's Leonard Law.
Yeah.
So in this case, he did his research. He contacted experts both at FIRE and at the Hoover Institution. He even brought one of the experts to his meeting, and he was vindicated, I think, because of his standing up and fighting for his rights. A dean at Stanford has actually said they're going to clarify those posting policies.
And I think it was nice that in the article that he wrote about the incident, he noted that this was kind of a learning experience for him. Even when he put up the posters, he wasn't sure about his stance on immigration, and this kind of helped him, think more about the issues and talk to people. And I think that's all what we'd really like to see when it comes to these discussions about hate speech.
Oh, definitely. And you said that Stanford was a private school, but it's still bound with the Constitution or the First Amendment or Leonard Law. So just to clarify, is hate speech protected speech? Is hateful speech considered to be unprotected speech? What is your stance on that, Luke?
Sure. I mean, at FIRE, I acknowledge every day when I talk to students that speech has tremendous power to move people. I mean, there's no doubt about that, and that's really why it's so important to protect. I would say the vast majority of hate speech is free speech. This is not a real legal distinction. So when you encounter hateful speech on campus, I always tell students that the best thing they can do if they're actually looking to create change is engage with it. If it is really the kind of ugly, noxious stuff that we've all seen, it really shouldn't take much to offer a fairly robust criticism. And if you're successful, it can be both a learning and a teaching opportunity there. Other things you can do involve holding a counter protest, inviting a different speaker. If you don't want to be quite so forward-facing, you can write an op-ed. I think the point is that the battle for justice is renewed through this sort of constant engagement.
Definitely. And even though hateful speech is protected by the Constitution, many college students, understandably, they want more. They want a more robust argument. Simply saying something is okay and it's legal doesn't make it right. So, Gordon, you are familiar with many of the arguments for hate speech bans, such as that these hateful rhetoric, they cause violence, they can cause genocide in some situations. Has your research borne that out? Does that argument hold water?
No, I mean, it's surprisingly to me, it's surprising how bad some of the arguments are. People, obviously people say the Klan, for example, who engages in violence, they also engage in hate speech. That's just, what those types of people do.
Yeah.
But the argument that the hate speech actually causes violence, the evidence is just really, there's nothing there. People make, just the assumption. Someone said something hateful, someone else committed violence, therefore one must have caused the other. And it's just, I can't say it's not so because it's hard to prove a negative, right? But the evidence is really thin.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing the Supreme Court said during its most recent decision in Mattal v. Tam, that look, the First Amendment protects the thought that we hate. It protects these hateful speeches, hateful rhetorics, despite the effects it may cause or the effects it may not cause. And another issue I was thinking about is that a lot of these students that call for these hate speech bans, what they're doing is they're pretty much telling the administration that I want you to create policies that restrict my rights. And many of these students believe that they're the ones that will determine what hate speech is, but really it's not the students at all, it's the administrators. So how do we best convey that to the students that we work with?
I think there's a lot of practical things. Like as a practical matter, censorship just doesn't work. It seems to, and we've seen this a number of times, it seems to embolden the very people that you're looking to censor. And it also, it could possibly suggest that you don't actually have the intellectual firepower to compete, compete in the marketplace of ideas. And we all know that to not be true,
Oh yeah, we have a lot of students in our Fire Student Network that very actively engage with each other and engage with the ideas that may be offensive or controversial, and they do an excellent job doing so. And I think this case particular with the flyers and the students seeing the flyers, crying, having the flyers be torn down, the whole thing, it's interesting because you have a conservative student being censored by liberal students, which is the opposite of what happened at Stanford within a week, which is you have a conservative newspaper calling for the firing of a liberal professor, which really shows that censorship is a bipartisan issue. So how do you think we best approach this issue by talking to students across the political spectrum? What arguments do we use to sway them to our side?
I think it's a lot of the practical arguments, just like the effects of what you're engaging in. Also, I always like to appeal to the philosophy of free speech and principle. That Ciccarello Mayer case was really interesting because, a few weeks after Drexel censored him, he was calling for disruption of a Charles Murray event at Villanova, and it's like, so I think at FIRE, we unfortunately see a lot of these fair weather friends who are tremendously principled when it serves their purpose. Yeah,
definitely. And as we can see from these incidents, Stanford is a school that has an interesting array of free speech policies that may not be helping their students or their professors for their academic freedom or free speech rights. Mary, is there a way we can reform these policies? How would we go about doing that?
Sure. Well, there's always opportunities for policy reform. And in Stanford's situation, and I think in campuses across the nation, one great first step to policy reform would be adopting a Chicago Statement, because that broadly is a statement by our administration saying we will not censor speech, we support robust academic freedom and inquiry and discussion. And I think that's a great first step to get the conversation started on campus.
It's also good for PR purposes, right? Before the free speech controversy even comes, you can have this statement to refer to. Exactly, and then you're not accused of taking sides. We've seen that a lot, where administrations will stand up for free expression and say they, are obliged to
keep the First Amendment principles alive and well on their campus, and then they're accused of taking sides for the speech they're protecting. And a way to avoid that, as you said, would be to adopt a Chicago statement where they can point to it and say, we adopted this last year, 2 years ago, we're committed to free expression no matter what the content of speech is.
Right, and it's a slippery slope also, because once you fire one professor, expel one student for their flyers, you're almost setting a precedent for the future punishment of professors and students for their protected free speech. So It's good to have the statement up front, be very clear and concise with your free speech policies. That way that when the controversy does come, which just seems like it inevitably will, I feel like every single week we see a new free speech controversy, universities are prepared for it. So as we are almost out of time here, is there any closing thoughts for convincing students and professors and universities that we should protect academic freedom and not ban hate speech?
I just want to say on hate speech, I think one closing thought is to look what happens in other countries that don't have the protections we have. I mean, Poland just this week made it illegal to argue that Poles were complicit in some way, or some Polish people were complicit in the Holocaust. And the argument was that that was a form of hate speech. And I'm sure people in Poland find that extremely offensive. So the same thing, Glenn Greenwald, I think late last year, maybe mid last year, had an article, and he's obviously a very liberal guy, saying that, look, in Europe, hate speech bans are used to silence people without political power. So I think that's, if we look how things happen in other countries, people might be a little less eager to implement those bans in our country.
Definitely, definitely. We have a whole world of hate speech bans. We can look to these countries and see what they want to do. All right, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day.